Welcome to Reformed Thinking, where we consider current events and big ideas through the unchanging light of God's Word. Today we're taking a special look at a topic that calls for both careful thought and faithful action. Hello and welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we unpack the information you've gathered and help you connect the dots. Today we're diving into, well, incredibly timely and frankly weighty subject, the environmental restoration of Ukraine after the war. You've brought us a stack of sources outlining a really detailed framework for rebuilding the land and waters. And it's all seen through a lens of Reformed theological principles, moral duty, and practical integrity.
That's right. And this deep dive, it isn't about simple fixes or, quick patches. Our mission today is to explore how this proposed framework moves beyond just reacting to damage. It's laying out a systematic and principled approach for what's going to be a vast, multifaceted restoration. We'll look at why this work is considered a moral duty, the sheer scale of the environmental injuries Ukraine has sustained, and importantly, a robust architecture designed to assure integrity and accountability at every single step.
And what's really striking from this material is how this framework suggests making honesty kind of the default, making it probable, and making cheating costly, which transforms this daunting task into an act of, faithful stewardship. And just to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about, one source assesses Ukraine as the most heavily contaminated country in the world, with explosive ordnance. I mean, just imagine the challenge that presents.
It's staggering.
And how a detailed, principled approach aims to address such a, staggering reality. So let's open up these sources and start our deep dive. Okay, so first up, this idea of moral duty. When we think about environmental repair, often, maybe, it's seen as something charitable, right? An optional extra. But the sources you shared present it as something far more fundamental, rooted in moral duty. Can you walk us through the core idea here?
Yeah, what's fascinating in these sources is exactly that. Environmental restoration isn't framed as optional philanthropy. It's presented as a moral duty, even a spiritual obligation. And this comes from a core conviction. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, from Psalm 24.1. And that conviction, it changes our perspective entirely. It shifts our view from one of, say, human ownership to one of human stewardship under God.
Okay, stewardship. And what does that actually look like in practice? How do these sources elaborate on what that means for us?
Well, humanity's original calling, as it's described in Genesis 2.15, it involves two key Hebrew verbs. There's abad, which means to serve or cultivate, and shamar, which means to keep or guard. And together, these verbs, they paint a picture of priestly care for creation. We're called to both develop creation's potential, help it flourish, and defend it from harm. And this isn't just a suggestion. The sources frame it as a divine mandate.
Right.
And the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is foundational for Reformed theology, affirms this. Chapter 4 talks about the inherent goodness of creation, and Chapter 5 states that God governs through ordinary means.
Ordinary means, so not just waiting for miracles.
Exactly. It implies that we expect restoration to occur through diligent human knowledge, prudence, careful labor, and lawful authority. Not primarily through miraculous interventions alone. It means our hands and minds are, in a sense, God's chosen tools for this work.
That's a powerful reframing. So it isn't just about cleaning up the mess, is it? It's acknowledging a brokenness that goes deeper. How does this framework connect environmental damage to the broader theological understanding of the fall and redemption?
Well, the sources describe the fall, humanity's rebellion against God, as having twisted both the human heart and the very ground itself. You see that in Genesis 3.17:19. War, then, in this theological context, is seen as a concentrated expression of this distortion. It makes environmental injury a visible scar of sin.
A visible scar.
Yeah, it's a tangible manifestation of humanity's fallen state, and therefore post-war rebuilding, it must carry a sort of penitential posture, a realistic expectation about what can be achieved in this fallen world, but also a hopeful aim for what can be restored.
And what does that hopeful aim mean for us today, especially when we talk about redemption in Christ? How does that factor in?
Redemption in Christ, as it's described in Colossians 1.15:20, it doesn't dissolve our creaturely responsibility. If anything, it restores it. It calls us back to that original mandate. This leads to what Reformed theology calls proximate justice.
Proximate justice. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means seeking real, measurable good in a fallen world. It's distinct from, utopian visions of perfect restoration that might just lead to disappointment or even inaction. It's about making tangible, good progress right here, right now, even understanding that full perfection awaits Christ's return. It keeps us focused on what is attainable and impactful in our present reality.
And how does God's moral law, the Decalogue, those 10 Commandments, how do they guide this duty of restoration? They seem ancient, but you're saying they have very modern, practical applications here.
Oh, absolutely they do. The moral law, especially the Decalogue, it instructs us in grateful obedience in all public affairs, not just our private piety. So protecting life that relates to you shall not murder, respecting property that ties directly into you shall not steal, and telling the truth, you shall not bear false witness. These aren't just abstract ideas.
Right.
They directly apply to things like honest measurements of damage, transparent reporting, fair dealings in reconstruction contracts, that sort of thing. The framework highlights Deuteronomy 20.1920.
The passage about not cutting down fruit trees during a siege.
Exactly. That ancient restraint on the wanton destruction of fruit trees during warfare. The sources argue this implies a clear duty of repair and restitution after conflict.
Can you give us other examples of this biblical idea of restitution playing out?
Certainly. The sources draw parallels to instances like Exodus 22.5-6. That's about fire spreading to another's field, where it says, "He who started the fire shall make full restitution." Or Zacchaeus' pledge in Luke 19.8-9, where he says he'll restore fourfold what he defrauded.
Right, going above and beyond.
These biblical examples, they establish principles: foreseeable risk, duties of care, negligence liability, proportionate compensation. And even lex talionis, the eye for an eye principle, it serves as a limit on vengeance, ensuring justice is fair, not excessive. These ancient laws provide the moral architecture for careful attribution of harm, proportionate remedies, and verifiable repair, even in our complex modern context.
Okay, that brings us to how we actually do this work. The sources mention embracing ordinary means and guarding against distortions. What does that look like in practice for something as massive as national restoration?
God ordinarily uses what the Westminster Confession, Chapter 5, calls second causes. This means that sound science and careful engineering, well, they're received as gifts of common grace. Psalm 19 talks about the heavens declaring God's glory. We can see his wisdom in creation and in the ways we learn to interact with it. This understanding allows believers and unbelievers to cooperate in achieving limited shared goods like clean water or healthy soil. It's pragmatic yet principled.
So it's about using the best tools we have, the best knowledge, but staying grounded theologically. What are these distortions the framework warns against then?
The framework guards against two significant distortions, really. The first is green idolatry, basically, worshiping creation over the creator, which Romans 1.25 warns against, elevating environmental concerns above God himself. The second is what's called technocratic messianism, which is the belief that human technique and programs alone can save us. Psalm 146.3 cautions us not to put our trust in princes or, in human systems alone. This perspective shapes how we approach the entire task, ensuring our efforts are grounded in reality and directed by divine purpose, without falling into either extreme.
Effective without being prideful, you could say.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so before we dive into the solutions proposed in this framework, it's really important to understand the scale of the challenge. The sources lay out a truly sobering picture of environmental damage in Ukraine. Can you give us an overview of the key injuries the country has sustained?
The environmental injuries are, yes, multifaceted and deeply interlinked. They form a layered crisis across many aspects of Ukraine's natural environment. One of the most visible and perhaps most far-reaching events was the breach of the Kakhovka Dam on June 6, 2023. UNEP, that's the UN Environment Program, described this as a far-reaching environmental disaster. It caused catastrophic flooding downstream, a rapid drawdown of the reservoir, and just profound changes in the flow regimes of the Dnipro River.
That sounds like a staggering event just on its own. What are the ripple effects, the longer-term consequences of something like the Kakhovka Dam breach?
Well, the longer-term risks are significant, and they extend far beyond that initial flood. We're looking at potentially lowered groundwater tables around the former reservoir area, a severe loss of irrigation water for huge swaths of agricultural land.
Which is critical for Ukraine's role as a breadbasket.
Absolutely critical. An immense stress on protected areas and vital wetlands along the lower Dnipro, particularly affecting the lower Dnipro National Nature Park system. Imagine a region that thrives on water suddenly facing a profound long-term shortage. It hits the environment, agriculture, livelihoods, everything.
That's a huge impact on water resources for nature and farming. What about the direct infrastructure? The water and sanitation systems people rely on daily. the basic services.
There's been extensive damage there, too, across the country. It's created a nationwide water, sanitation, and hygiene fragility. The World Bank, in its RDNA3 report, that's their third rapid damage and needs assessment, they documented 207 damaged or destroyed water treatment facilities and 234 sewage treatment plants.
And how does it translate to the daily lives of people? What does that mean for access to safe water?
It directly impacted an estimated 9.6 million people. They've experienced limited or interrupted access to safe water. And UNICEF has warned that roughly a quarter of wastewater plants and networks are damaged. Critically, most of these utilities lack reliable backup power. So during blackouts, which are common in conflict, the systems fail, compounding public health risks.
It's a constant struggle for basic, safe water.
Yes, with enormous public health consequences.
Beyond the immediate damage to water systems, what kind of contamination are we looking at from industrial activities and just the byproduct of warfare itself? Ukraine has a big industrial footprint.
Right. The conflict has led to repeated incidents at energy infrastructure power plants, substations, also oil storage and refining facilities, industrial plants, agro-processing sites. These events have caused, acute air pollution episodes. But maybe more significantly, they pose serious risks of surface and groundwater contamination. We're talking fuels, combustion byproducts, various hazardous chemicals seeping into the environment. It's often an unseen threat that can persist for decades.
And then there's the sheer physical aftermath, all the debris and rubble from destroyed buildings and infrastructure. What kind of environmental challenges does that present?
Adding to this, the sheer volume of war-related debris and rubble presents another multi-year environmental challenge. Beyond the immediate hazards like dust, asbestos, heavy metals, and of course unexploded ordnance, UXO, mixed in, the costs for debris clearance alone are estimated at around $13 billion by the UNDP, the UN Development Program.
$13 billion just for debris clearance.
Just for clearance. And mismanagement of this debris, if it's not handled carefully, if it's dumped improperly, it can easily lead to the recontamination of sites. That makes restoration efforts even more complex and costly down the line. It's not just removal, it's careful, considered processing.
And the sources mentioned Ukraine is the most heavily contaminated country in the world with explosive ordnances. That's a truly staggering statistic. What are the implications?
That assessment comes from UNMAS, the UN Mine Action Service. We're talking millions of mines and other explosive ordnance scattered across former battlefields, agricultural land, forests. The World Bank's RDNA3 estimates the potentially contaminated area at about 174,000 square kilometers.
It's larger than what? Greece?
Portugal. Larger than Portugal, yes. And this contamination has severe implications. It denies access to vast stretches of farms, forests, wetlands. That significantly delays ecological recovery. It also forces hazardous informal clearance efforts by civilians, which leads to tragic accidents and prevents safe use of land for anything farming, rebuilding, recreation. This widespread contamination is a monumental obstacle to both human safety and environmental recovery. It creates this invisible, deadly landscape.
And what about the natural landscapes themselves, the forests, the grasslands, biodiversity? How have they fared amidst all this destruction?
By the end of 2023, that RDNA3 report tallied over 211,000 hectares of damaged forest and over 543,000 hectares of burned landscapes.
Huge areas.
Devastating areas. These trends are primarily driven by shelling, military vehicle activity, and widespread wildfires that often ignite in contested regions or spread from military action. These conflict-driven fires and habitat fragmentation, they amplify greenhouse gas emissions, they erode crucial ecosystem services like water filtration and soil stabilization, and they accelerate the spread of opportunistic or invasive species in these disturbed habitats. Wetlands, too, vital for water storage, filtration, biodiversity. They've suffered direct physical damage from shelling and vehicles, plus indirect hydrological changes from dams being destroyed or drainage disrupted. It's a widespread assault on the natural systems.
It sounds like these aren't isolated incidents at all, but rather an interconnected web of problems that feed into each other, making everything worse.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize the interdependence of these harms. They create powerful feedback loops. For example, hydrological shocks, like the Kakhovka Dam breach, they intensify the transport of pollutants across vast areas. Damaged utilities and energy grids magnify public health risks from contaminated water or sewage overflows. Explosive ordnance prevents access for essential remediation efforts for scientific assessment. And as we said, any mismanagement of war-related debris can easily recontaminate sites, creating a cycle of damage.
It really illustrates the layered and complex nature of the crisis. Addressing one problem often requires considering its impact on many others.
Yes, it's not a simple checklist. It's a living, reacting system of damage that needs a holistic approach.
Okay, so faced with such vast destruction, and given the context of conflict, questions of integrity and accountability become absolutely central, don't they? How does the proposed framework seek to assure that the restoration process itself is conducted ethically and effectively?
Integrity within this framework, it's not just seen as a good management practice. It's understood as obedience to God's law. Specifically, the 8th commandment against theft and the 9th commandment against false witness. Given that war inherently creates increased opportunities for corruption through rushed procurements, opaque funds, lack of oversight, a deliberate integrity architecture is considered essential.
An integrity architecture, I like that term.
Yeah, it focuses on building systems to make honesty probable and cheating costly. It reflects that principle from Proverbs 29.4, by justice the king establishes the land. It's about setting up the guardrails from the very beginning.
That makes sense. So it's about setting up the right structures and roles. You mentioned sphere sovereignty earlier, a key reform concept. How did that apply to the different actors involved in this massive restoration?
Right. The framework operates on the principle of sphere sovereignty, the idea that God assigns distinct complementary roles to different institutions, each with its own specific authority and responsibilities. So you have this civil magistrate, the government. Its role is setting just rules, enforcing liability and restitution, coordinating large-scale remediation. And Ukraine has already taken some crucial steps here, like approving all 9 river basin management plans, the RBMPs, in late 2024.
Aligning with EU standards.
Exactly, aligning with the EU Water Framework Directive. These plans provide measurable targets for water body restoration. They've also mandated strategic environmental assessments, SEAs, for public plans in sectors like energy and land management. That ensures structured, accountable governance. Then you have households and trades. This includes professionals like engineers, auditors, lab technicians, deminers. They ensure integrity through their competent craft and honest work, doing their part as unto the Lord within their sphere. Each sphere has its part to play, respecting the others.
That's a good overview of the roles. But how do we actually see what's happening on the ground? What concrete measures are proposed for radical transparency to prevent corruption? This seems key.
Radical transparency is absolutely a cornerstone of this integrity architecture. The framework proposes adopting an open contracting standard. This means all restoration contracts, any amendments, unit prices, winning and losing bids, evaluation minutes, delivery milestones, all of it must be published in machine-readable form, so anyone, journalists, citizens, analysts, can download and analyze the data.
Machine-readable is important, not just a scanned PDF.
Crucial difference. And Ukraine's existing public beneficial ownership register, which is quite pioneering, it discloses the real owners behind vendor companies, is highlighted as a living example of this principle. This helps prevent conflicts of interest, shell companies, collusion, especially given the success Ukraine's already had with the Prozoro e-procurement system in restraining corruption.
Beyond that, what other transparency measures are built in?
Well, there are requirements for conflict of interest declarations from officials and project managers, and these need to be searchable by the public. The system must also automatically flag related parties across bids and regions. This helps prevent things like contract splitting or shell company schemes designed to hide true ownership or bypass thresholds. For environmental testing, which is critical here, all labs must publish their methods, their quality assurance quality control, QA/QC summaries, their accreditation status, and importantly, have digitized and auditable chain of custody forms for samples, so you can track a sample from field to result.
Right, maintaining the integrity of the data.
Precisely. And then there's the Public Creation Stewardship Dashboard we mentioned. This is envisioned to pair financial expenditure with concrete outcomes, hectares cleared, river status improved, etc. It would publish procurement ledgers, sampling methods, lab partners, all for public verification. Plus, crucially, public comment channels and regular, say, quarterly open books briefings where officials present their work and answer questions directly. It's about letting the light in at every stage.
Those are robust transparency measures. What about the financial side? How does the framework ensure that money is handled responsibly and that contracts are sound, preventing fraud and waste?
This is where the hard financial and contractual controls come in. They're quite detailed. They include requiring things like bid securities and performance bonds sized appropriately to the project risk. This ensures contractors have skin in the game. Using escrow accounts for long-term obligations, like the maintenance of contained toxic sites, so funds are definitely available years down the line when needed. making payments only on verifiable milestones. This means tying disbursements to independent field verification, maybe including geotagged photos, random spot checks, even community sign-offs where appropriate.
So no payment until the work is proven done.
That's the idea. Also, capping discretionary change orders. Cost overruns above a certain threshold would trigger an external review.
And what about consequences for those who don't play by the rules, if fraud or collusion is found?
There needs to be enforcement. Debarment policies would be used for collusion, fraud, or chronic non-performance, with a publicly published list of suspended vendors. You need to know who not to trust. Using reference class pricing to establish benchmarks and detect outlier bids or inflated costs, ensuring fair market rates are paid. To prevent coziness or undue influence between, say, contractors and auditors, the framework mandates rotating independent auditors and testing labs on fixed cycles, and requiring cross-checks like split samples sent to different labs or blind retest to ensure data integrity.
That seems vital for trustworthy data.
Absolutely. Strong whistleblower protections are also crucial. A single, clear complaint window, tight timelines for response, and real legal protection plus rewards for those who provide solid evidence of wrongdoing. And finally, for procurement, using documented scoring rubrics for evaluating bids, requiring unanimous sign-off from the committee or recorded dissent, and implementing random rescoring for quality control. It's a multi-layered defense against corruption.
That's an impressive array of controls, clearly designed to reduce opportunities for dishonesty. But even with all of that, how do you ensure ongoing vigilance and real-time accountability in such a large-scale, long-term effort? What role do data analytics and citizen oversight play?
Data, risk management, and citizen oversight are integrated to provide that continuous vigilance. A specialized red flag analytics unit is proposed. This unit would screen bids and payments for classic patterns of corruption, things like repeated awards to linked firms, identical pricing on supposedly competitive bids, or a cluster of awards just below tender thresholds.
Using data to spot anomalies.
Exactly. And importantly, the flags raised and the follow-up actions taken would be published to build public trust. It's not enough to just detect. You have to show you're acting on it. Furthermore, basin-level citizen oversight councils are suggested. These would comprise local leaders, pastors, agronomists, engineers, physicians, people with local knowledge and stake. They would review the dashboards, scrutinize contracts, and raise alarms if things look wrong. The framework sees these councils as an expression of the communion of saints serving the public good, a local, non-coercive layer of oversight.
So it's not just distant bureaucrats watching, but local people invested in their own communities. How else do communities get involved?
Through things like rotating site walks. This involves communities directly in verifying on-the-ground progress. Are the promised riparian buffers actually planted? Is the rubble sorting yard operating properly? And crucially, connecting back to the phased plan we'll discuss, there are gate checks that are directly linked to these integrity metrics. If audit pass rates lag, if beneficial ownership data is missing for too many contractors, if grievance redress mechanisms are stalled, then the scale-up pauses.
The funding stops or slows.
Yes, until these integrity issues are resolved. This institutionalizes humility. It requires investigation, correction, and, if needed, repentance when indicators trend negatively. It bakes accountability into every step of the process. The work can only progress when integrity is demonstrably upheld.
Okay, this whole approach seems very structured with these gate checks you just mentioned. How will this complex restoration be managed over time, moving from the immediate crisis to long-term renewal?
Yeah, this is where the framework really puts its principles into action on a timeline. Restoration proceeds through 4 discernible phases, and each phase has these pre-declared gate checks to prevent, haste, drift, and waste. This phased approach, it honors creaturely limits. We can't fix everything at once, and it translates those moral demands for truth and justice into concrete administrative action. Each phase prioritizes life first, then irreplaceable assets, then thinks about reversibility and cost effectiveness, advancing only when measurable thresholds are met. It's a carefully designed progression.
Let's start with phase 1 then. What are the immediate priorities in those first, say, 0 to 12 months, the relief and triage phase?
Phase 1, relief and triage, spans roughly the first year. The main aim here is simple: protect human life and stop any secondary damage from occurring or getting worse. Key activities involve civil authorities deploying things like mobile water treatment units, setting up temporary chlorination points, providing emergency sanitation to keep disease at bay. Basic survival needs. Engineers work to stabilize known toxic hotspots, maybe using temporary covers, building berms, installing drainage controls to prevent spread. And mine action teams, operating under recognized international standards, focus on opening safe corridors to critical assets, water intakes, well fields, wastewater plants, so crews can actually get into work safely.
And establishing baselines is key here too, right? Knowing where you started.
Absolutely. Rapid, standardized assessments establish those baselines for water quality, contaminated soils, debris composition, habitat condition, and the results must be published on a simple public dashboard right away, ensuring truthful witness from the start.
So what are the critical gate checks before moving on from this immediate crisis phase? What has to be demonstrably achieved?
The gate checks for Phase 1 are crucial. Things like emergency potable water must be reaching at least, say, 95% of affected residents in the target districts. A verified inventory of high-risk sites must be secured against runoff and wind-blown spread. You have to contain the worst threats. A functioning data portal with published protocols must be up and running, and you need third-party confirmation that explosive ordnance clearance has successfully opened access to that first tranche of priority sites. The principle is, no expansion into complex civil work should occur until these basics are demonstrably met. You can't build a house on a shaky foundation.
Makes sense. Okay, once that initial crisis is managed and the immediate dangers are contained, what happens in Phase 2, recovery and repair? This is maybe years 1 to 3.
Phase 2, recovery and repair. Yes, over roughly 1 to 3 years. The aim shifts now to implementing durable fixes. So water and wastewater plants are rebuilt, preferably using modular, energy-resilient units that can better withstand future shocks. Things like riparian buffers, those natural vegetation strips along rivers, and stormwater pretreatment systems start getting installed. Leak detection in water networks is intensified. Soil and site remediation begins, using a tiered logic. Acute hot sites, the really dangerous spots, might get excavation or secure containment, whereas more diffuse contamination might be addressed by monitored natural recovery or bioremediation, perhaps linked to agronomic cycles on farmland.
And what about all that war rubble you mentioned earlier? How is that huge volume handled in this phase?
Right, the rubble. In Phase 2, it's segregated at the source as much as possible, screened for hazards and recyclable materials, and then responsibly recycled or disposed of. Hazardous fines, like asbestos dust, have to be tracked to licensed disposal sites. You need manifests. Habitat restoration also begins reforestation, planting shelter belts, reconnecting wetlands where possible, implementing erosion control measures, all sequenced where demining and hydrological conditions permit. Legally, this is when restitution pathways need to be formalized, liability rules clarified, and performance bonds required from contractors. And economically, pro-poor subsidies are put in place to prevent compliance costs from crushing vulnerable households, things like helping pay for new septic systems if required.
And what are the gate checks that signal progress and allow for further investment in Phase 2? What needs to be shown?
Gate checks for this phase include things like published as built documentation for the repaired utilities, showing the work was done to standard. Statistically significant improvements on priority river reaches towards agreed ecological quality targets. You need to see the water getting cleaner. A verified decrease in contaminant loads at key sentinel monitoring sites. Audited manifest demonstrating responsible handling of debris flows. And maybe an indicator like an on-time payment rate to contractors, which can help deter informal rent-seeking or delays. The idea is funds for larger landscape projects or less critical infrastructure are withheld if these core recovery indicators lag. Measure tangible, verified progress first.
Then, looking further down the line, once the immediate repairs are underway, what does reform and resilience in Phase 3 entail? This is the 3 to 10 year mark, a longer view.
Phase 3, reform and resilience, spanning roughly 3-10 years, aims to strengthen governance and systems to endure future shocks, whether environmental or conflict-related. During this period, river basin management gets fully implemented. This means setting and enforcing ecological flows, removing or retrofitting obsolete barriers like old dams, advancing fish passage and floodplain reconnection projects, coordinated with community flood safety measures. The power grid is hardened and prudently diversified to reduce losses and protect essential services during outages. Agriculture transitions from just emergency yield recovery towards building long-term soil health, using practices like crop rotations, cover crops, integrating livestock, planned fallows.
Building back better, essentially.
That's the concept. Cities implement green corridors, stormwater capture systems, remediate old industrial brownfields, linking social renewal with ecological function. And that integrity architecture we discussed matures. Open contracting becomes routine. Beneficial ownership checks keep vendors honest. Rotating independent audits test the books regularly. Whistleblower protections become fully functional and trusted.
And the gate checks for this significant reform phase, which shows that resilience is actually increasing.
Gate checks for Phase 3 focus on systemic health. Things like independent audit pass rates consistently above an agreed target, showing the financial controls are working. Grievance redress mechanisms resolving complaints within bounded timelines, showing accountability. Verified increases in soil organic matter on representative farms, a key indicator of soil health. Kilometers of fish passage restored in rivers, and a measurable reduction in flood damages in previously exposed neighborhoods showing adaptation measures are effective. If audits start failing or ecological indicators flatline or decline, the framework says investment should pivot back to addressing those bottlenecks rather than just proceeding with showcase projects. It demands correction.
And finally, Phase 4, renewal and handoff. This sounds like it's about making this work sustainable for the very long term, embedding it into the culture beyond just donor projects. What does that look like 10+ years out?
Indeed. Phase 4, renewal and handoff, covers 10 years and beyond. The aim here is to normalize this long-horizon work and embed environmental stewardship into civic habits. Environmental monitoring should become a civic habit, not just something done because a donor requires it. Water quality stations, biodiversity transects, soil monitoring panels, flood markers, all feeding that public creation stewardship dashboard routinely. Education pipelines, things like apprenticeships for water operators, foresters, deminers, need to be established to stabilize a skilled domestic workforce for the long haul. And the church, operating within her spiritual lane, continues to teach creation, providence, and vocation. Sponsoring local stewardship projects, perhaps, like parish tree nurseries or river cleanups, providing ongoing diaconal care for cleanup workers or affected communities.
And the final gate checks here would seem more about institutional durability than immediate funding triggers.
Exactly. The gate checks for Phase 4 focus on institutional durability. Is there continuous data publication happening without external pressure? Is the relevant curriculum embedded in schools and technical institutes? Are maintenance budgets for restored infrastructure being met from domestic revenues, not just foreign aid? And, importantly, is there periodic theological review to ensure that neighbor love, honesty, and prudence still govern the work? This helps ensure the effort is truly owned by the nation and people for generations to come.
It's clear that these phases are interconnected, but what are the overarching controls or principles that guide all of them, no matter the specific task or phase?
Throughout all phases, 3 cross-cutting controls are essential to guard against error and ensure the core moral duties are upheld. First is truthfulness. Measurements, contracts, progress reports, everything must be public and intelligible, serving the 9th commandment against bearing false witness. Second is justice. The costs and benefits of restoration need to be distributed fairly, without crushing the poor or vulnerable, honoring the 8th commandment against theft, including theft by neglect or unfair burden. And third is humility. When indicators show harm or stagnation, plans must change and adjust. This embodies the principle that providence ordinarily uses means, but we are fallible sinners who must be willing to correct course, even repent, when our efforts fall short or cause unintended harm. This phased approach, with its built-in gate checks and these cross-cutting controls, aims not just to manage projects, but really to disciple a nation toward clean water, healed soils, safer towns, and a public life marked by integrity under Christ's lordship.
Okay, so a phased plan with built-in controls addresses future actions, but what about the harms already inflicted, environmental damage that's already happened? How does this framework approach the idea of justice and restitution for that damage?
Justice after war, in this framework, is presented as a clear mandate, not simply a mood or an optional pursuit. It's grounded firmly in God's moral law, which requires the repair of damage as far as providence allows. Restitution, specifically, is framed as the legal face of neighbor love.
The legal face of neighbor love. That's an interesting phrase.
It means that those responsible for harm have a moral and a legal duty to make full restitution where possible and identifiable. It's about setting things right, making amends for the damage done.
Can you elaborate on the biblical basis for this, beyond general principles? Are there specific examples that show how these ideas translate into practical requirements?
Absolutely. The framework points to several biblical examples that establish the principles for restitution. Exodus 22.56, for instance, the case of the fire spreading to another's field. He who started the fire shall make full restitution. Very direct. Similarly, Exodus 21.3334 describes liability for an uncovered pit that harms an animal. These case laws, they establish enduring principles. Foreseeable risk imposes duties of care, negligence heightens liability, compensation should be proportionate, not vindictive. Even lex talionis, an eye for an eye, served as a limit on vengeance, ensuring fairness. These ancient laws provide the moral architecture for careful attribution of harm, proportionate remedies, and verifiable repair.
That's a clear legal foundation from the Old Testament. And then there's Zacchaeus' pledge in the New Testament. How does that fit in?
Zacchaeus' pledge in Luke 19:8-9, "If I have defrauded anyone, I restore it fourfold," further illustrates a gospel-shaped instinct to repair harm, even beyond strict legal requirement. The sources emphasize that personal forgiveness, while absolutely crucial on an individual level, does not erase these civil duties of restitution. One doesn't cancel the other. And the magistrate's role, highlighted in Proverbs 29.4, "By justice the king establishes the land," is key here. The state has a God-given role in enforcing liability and preserving an even scale for rich and poor alike, ensuring justice is done publicly and fairly.
So how are these biblical principles translated into practical steps for implementation? How do you actually do restitution for something as complex as environmental damage on a national scale? Seems incredibly difficult.
It is difficult, but the framework suggests it proceeds through ordinary means suited to truth and equity. First, it requires establishing a transparent claims and evidence pathway. This involves things like a national registry for environmental damage incidents, standardized sampling protocols, a clear, verifiable chain of custody for samples, peer review of analytical methods. Proof must meet sober standards, drawing from Deuteronomy 19.15's principle of needing multiple witnesses, but adapted to scientific inference. This means requiring multiple lines of data, reproducibility, independent confirmation. Careful attribution of harms, distinguishing direct, indirect, cumulative is essential, prioritizing remedies where liability is clearest, and the harms to human life or essential ecosystems are greatest.
And once you've proven the harm and attributed it as best as possible, how do you decide what the right remedy is? Does restitution always mean digging up contaminated soil, for instance?
Not necessarily. Second, the principle is to match the remedy to the injury. For acute toxic hotspots threatening public health, justice might indeed call for excavation or secure containment. However, for more diffuse contamination, perhaps from air deposition over a wide area where removal might actually worsen the situation by stirring things up or destroying soil structure, then monitored natural recovery or perhaps bioremediation using plants or microbes might be the most faithful stewardship. The duty is to restore the land's good, its beneficial function, not merely to perform a visible, perhaps ultimately unhelpful act. It requires wisdom and prudence.
What other practical steps are there to ensure restitution actually happens and lasts?
Third, it's crucial to bind contractors and liable parties. This means requiring performance bonds, setting up escrow accounts for long-term monitoring or maintenance, getting warranties mechanisms to ensure restitution endures beyond political cycles or the initial burst of attention. Fourth, the framework insists on differentiating criminal culpability from civil liability. Criminal culpability, things like willful attacks on protected assets like dams or chemical plants, or deliberate illegal dumping, or fraudulent reporting should be punished according to criminal law. Civil liability covering negligence or perhaps strict responsibility for ultra-hazardous activities should compel repair and compensation. In both cases, the framework states clearly that corrupt bargains granting impunity are prohibited. Justice demands accountability.
That sounds comprehensive for cases where responsibility can be pinned down. But what about harms that are hard to attribute to a specific actor, or damages that cross borders? How does the framework ensure justice still prevails in those trickier situations?
That's a key challenge. For harms that are unattributable or perhaps transboundary, the framework proposes pooled mechanisms but without sacrificing moral clarity. An environmental injuries fund is suggested, but it needs to be established with 3 key safeguards to prevent it becoming just a slush fund or letting polluters off the hook. First, contributions should be sized to the risk and proven harm, perhaps through levies on potentially polluting industries, to prevent moral hazard and encourage responsible behavior upstream. Second, it must have independent governance with strong citizen oversight to ensure public trust and accountability in how funds are used. Third, it needs a pro-poor design, ensuring that compliance costs or remediation efforts funded by it don't unduly burden vulnerable populations. And crucially, if individual responsibility for a specific harm covered by the fund is later proven, the fund should have mechanisms to reclaim those costs from the culpable parties. No free passes just because the cause was initially murky.
And how does this connect back to protecting basic property rights and also the wider commons, things like clean air and water that belong to everyone?
The 8th commandment, "You shall not steal," is applied quite broadly here. It forbids both the literal theft of a farmer's topsoil through contamination and the figurative theft of public cleanup money through collusive contracting or graft. So those integrity measures we discussed, open procurements, verified beneficial ownership, rotated audits, shielded whistleblowers, are all seen as practical applications of truth, Ninth Commandment, and justice, Eighth Commandment, in the context of restitution. They're designed to prevent the process of repair itself from becoming an occasion for new sin, ensuring the remedy maintains its integrity.
So like all other phases, there are also cross-cutting controls for justice and restitution. It seems truthfulness, justice, and humility are the watchwords throughout.
Yes, absolutely. Throughout the entire restitution process, those three are vital. Truthfulness means measurements, claims, contracts, progress reports must be public and intelligible. Justice ensures costs and benefits are distributed fairly, protecting the poor. And humility means plans must be adjusted based on evidence, acknowledging limits and potential errors. Ultimately, restitution isn't just about assigning blame, it's about the patient restoration of shared goods, drinkable water, healthy soils, living forests, to enable communities to flourish, protect the vulnerable, and honor God as the owner of all.
Okay, this is clearly a vast undertaking involving many different actors, the civil magistrate, various trades and professions, citizens. What is the specific contribution of the church in this whole context? What is her particular calling, and what is she uniquely positioned to bring to this work that maybe no other institution can?
The church's unique role, according to these sources, is spiritual, moral, and pastoral. It's explicitly not technical or coercive. Her charter is the Great Commission administered through the ordinary means of grace: word, sacrament, prayer. It's not the management of dams, landfills, or drainage basins. The church doesn't usurp civil authority. She doesn't intermeddle with civil affairs, as the Westminster Confession puts it, chapter 31, paragraph 4, except perhaps by humble petition in extraordinary cases. She doesn't grasp the sword of the state or write the technical standards for environmental remediation. Instead, she focuses on what no other institution can: the conscience and the heart.
So it's primarily about forming the people who will do the work, shaping their consciences. How does that translate into practical action for the church? What does that look like?
Her primary contribution is described as moral and conscience formation. She forms consciences by faithfully preaching and teaching on creation, providence, human sin, redemption, vocation, and the moral law. This helps believers, Christians, see soils, rivers, contracts, spreadsheets, all as arenas of obedience to God. Understanding that the earth is the Lord's from Psalm 24.1 has real-world implications. Catechesis, or instruction, must emphasize the positive duties of the Decalogue. So regarding the 8th and 9th commandments, against theft and false witness, she teaches professionals in her pews, engineers, auditors, contractors, to prize honest weights and measures, to refuse bribes, to keep their oaths and specifications, and to pursue restitution where harm is traceable, like Zacchaeus did.
Making the connection explicit between faith and daily work.
Exactly. She makes it clear that stealing public funds is still stealing God's resources held in trust by the magistrate. Lying with numbers on a report is still bearing false witness. And unrepentant fraud among members, if demonstrated, is subject to church discipline based on principles like those in 1 Corinthians 5. It's about spiritual formation for tangible earthly good.
Beyond that critical role of moral formation, what else does the church specifically contribute?
The church is vital for prayer and intercession. Congregational worship should include specific lament and intercession for a wounded land, perhaps drawing on Psalms like 10 or 90, and regular petitions for kings and all who are in high positions, as 1 Timothy 2.1-2 instructs. That includes praying for rulers, administrators, engineers, deminers involved in this difficult restoration work. She also offers comfort and mercy. The church comforts the traumatized by war and environmental loss. Deacons, as ministers of mercy, can stand in the gap in practical ways, ensuring integrity reforms don't inadvertently crush the poor.
How might they do that?
Perhaps through small grants for protective equipment for cleanup workers, or water filters for families with contaminated wells, or assistance navigating paperwork for aid, or care funds for injured workers, or counseling for displaced families. This embodies mercy while still honoring the jurisdictional boundaries. The church isn't running the government program, but caring for people affected by it.
It seems like the church can also lead by example, modeling good stewardship on its own property, right?
That's right. Churches can model stewardship and integrity right where they are, through truthful contracting for their own building projects, responsible stormwater management on their grounds, maybe tree planting, safe waste handling. They can preach with their ledgers as well as their lips, demonstrating what faithful stewardship looks like in practice. This builds credibility. The church also plays a crucial role in supporting workers and upholding truth. She fortifies workers who are facing dangerous conditions or ethical temptations, like graft, with God's promises and presence, training them to refuse bribes and embrace costly truth-telling. There's also what the sources call a cessationist sobriety here, meaning the church doesn't primarily wait for miracles or instant cleansing of the land. Instead, she teaches prayerful patience and the faithful use of ordinary means. Truthful measurement, kept contracts, enforced penalties, hard work.
And what are the distortions the church must guard against in this work to ensure she stays true to her specific calling?
She explicitly guards against distortions. The church must reject both green idolatry, worshiping the creation rather than the creator, as Romans 1.25 warns against, and also technocratic messianism, putting ultimate faith in human technique and programs to save, which Psalm 146.3 cautions against. By staying within her God-given spiritual lane, preaching, praying, discipling, exercising discipline, showing mercy, the church serves as a kind of quiet engine of integrity within the public sphere. This strengthens magistrates' hand for good, ennobles the work of households and trades, and helps ensure that efforts to repair fields, rivers, and towns are carried out with integrity and hope, bearing witness that the earth truly belongs to the crucified and risen King.
Okay, you've mentioned the Creation Stewardship Dashboard several times as this key tool for public accountability. Could you give us a more vivid picture of how this dashboard actually functions? What kinds of metrics does it collect to assure everything we've discussed, the integrity, the progress, the justice is truly happening?
The Creation Stewardship Dashboard is envisioned as a central public truth-telling tool. It's designed to embody those 8th and 9th commandments: no theft by waste or graft, and no false witness by inflated claims. It's described as covenantal in tone, meaning it reflects promises made between the government, contractors, donors, and the public, and tracks whether those promises are being kept. It needs to be transparent in method publishing how things are measured, not just the results, and practical in its aim, guiding decisions and controlling funding through those gate checks we talked about.
How is the data on this dashboard assured to be accurate and reliable? What makes it trustworthy in a system that's aiming for radical transparency, especially when corruption is a concern?
Well, every single indicator on the dashboard has to be anchored to specifics, a clear baseline. Where do we start? A target and a time horizon. Where are we going and by when? A defined measurement method, a frequency of reporting. And a designated custodian, someone, is accountable for that data point. Critically, all the data, the methods used, the QA/QC summaries, the chain of custody records for samples, all public, machine-readable, and versioned, so independent verification by citizens, auditors, researchers is possible. The framework pairs that spiritual call for integrity with technical rigor, mandating practices like split samples, blind retests, rotating auditors, third-party spot checks. And furthermore, because justice protects the poor, the dashboard absolutely must include indicators tracking whether costs and benefits are being fairly shared, ensuring the vulnerable aren't unduly burdened.
That sounds incredibly thorough. To give our listeners a clearer picture, could you maybe pick 2 or 3 truly representative metrics from each category, outcome, process, equity, and ecclesial, that best illustrate what this dashboard would actually show?
Sure, let's try that. Let's start with outcome metrics. These capture the measurable healing of creation, the actual results. For water, you might see the percentage of drinking water systems in your specific region meeting national health standards, updated monthly. Or maybe the ecological status, excellent, good, fair, poor of a particular river reach based on biological indicators updated annually. For soils, you could track trends in soil organic matter on index farms, showing if soil health is improving. Or hectares of land verified as returned to safe cultivation after explosive ordnance clearance in a given district. For habitats, maybe forest cover change detected by satellite, or indices tracking pollinator populations in restored areas. These would be disaggregated by basin and municipality for local engagement. If you live near the Dnipro, you should be able to see data relevant to your part of the river.
Okay, that shows the results. What about the how, the integrity of the process itself? What would process metrics look like?
That's where process and integrity metrics come in. These ensure honest means are being used. You'd track things like the audit pass rate for environmental projects. Are they meeting financial and technical standards? Or the share of contract value awarded through fully open competition versus sole source or emergency procedures. It would monitor the completeness of beneficial ownership data submitted by vendors. Are we seeing who really profits? In demining, it might report hectares cleared to standard, not just swept, and crucially, the lag time between clearance and verified safe public use of that land. These process indicators are the ones directly linked to those funding gate checks. If audit pass rates dip too low or beneficial ownership data is missing for too many contracts, scale-up pauses until integrity recovers.
And the framework specifically mentioned concern for the vulnerable. How is that reflected in the dashboard through equity and mercy metrics? What would those track?
Equity and mercy metrics are designed to reflect the moral law's concern for the vulnerable, making sure neighbor love isn't just a slogan. They'd track things like the share of low-income households in affected areas receiving targeted support for compliance, maybe assistance with water filters, septic repairs, or connecting to safe wells. They could monitor the average household burden of water tariffs and restored systems, ensuring affordability. Also, the percentage of cleanup jobs meeting basic safety and personal protective equipment (PPE) standards would be tracked, along with injury rates among cleanup crews and UXO teams, and the coverage of care funds for those injured workers. This helps ensure that the work itself doesn't exploit or harm the workers doing it.
And finally, how are the church's unique role and perhaps individual vocations reflected on this public dashboard? That seems like a different kind of metric.
Ecclesial and vocational metrics are included to help keep the church in her lane while also energizing her people for faithful action in their spheres. These might track congregational participation rates in specific mercy projects, like sponsoring local river cleanups or parish tree nurseries, or completion rates for adult catechesis modules focusing on the Decalogue's positive duties related to work and public life. They could track the number of church members trained and serving in public-facing roles requiring high integrity, like certified auditors or lab technicians, the frequency of specific public prayer and services for rulers and workers involved in restoration, or the number of churches adopting formal stewardship practices on their own properties. These are seen as quiet levers of cultural repair, demonstrating the church's positive influence without her trying to usurp civil authority.
So the dashboard is not just about static numbers, but about facilitating continuous improvement and accountability, baking humility right into the system itself.
Exactly. The dashboard is designed to be user-friendly for the public, yet deep enough for experts to audit. With basin maps, drill downs to site-level data, downloadable tables, a clear change log showing when numbers move and why. It explicitly links money spent to outcomes achieved. It includes early warning flags when indicators trend negatively, and it provides that public comment channel in those quarterly open books briefings. Crucially, as you said, it's designed to bake repentance into the system. When metrics expose harm, failure, or stagnation, leaders are expected publicly to explain, correct, and, if needed, reverse course. This transforms measurement from a bureaucratic exercise into, well, doxology in action, honest scales, clean hands, and visible progress that honor the Lord of the earth and serve the neighbors who live upon it.
Okay, a framework this detailed, this principled, will naturally face scrutiny. The sources anticipate several objections, which is good. It shows they've thought through the pushback. Let's look at some of these. For instance, some might argue that all this focus on the church's role, even indirectly, sounds like mission drift, moving away from simply preaching the gospel towards managing physical infrastructure or environmental policy. How does the framework respond to that kind of concern?
It's a really important question to address directly, and the framework does. The reply is clear. The church's role remains fundamentally spiritual, moral, and pastoral. It focuses on forming consciences through word, sacrament, and prayer. She does not usurp civil tasks like running water plants or managing rubble disposal. However, by teaching truthfulness, restitution, the dignity of vocation, the church equips its members, the engineers, auditors, deminers, and the pews, to be agents of measurable good and neighbor love in their secular callings. Thereby, as Titus 2 says, adorning the doctrine of God our Savior. It's about influencing the doers, not doing the deeds herself.
Another potential concern could be about the reliance on scientific methods, on data, on assessments. People might say science is secular. Relying so heavily on scientific assessments compromises faith. How does the framework address that?
The reply here is grounded firmly in the Reformed understanding of common grace and God's providence. God ordinarily works by ordinary means. That's Westminster Confession, chapter 5, paragraph 3. Sound science and careful engineering are received as gifts of common grace, ways of understanding the creation God made. Like Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. We learn about God through his works. Applying truth in measurement, which is required by the 9th commandment and Proverbs 11.1 about honest scales, isn't bowing to scientism. It's using God's appointed means to understand and interact responsibly with his creation. It's utilizing methods, not adopting a whole godless worldview.
What about the economic impact? Especially in a country needing to rebuild rapidly, some might argue all these environmental safeguards will just slow economic growth.
The framework counters this by highlighting that Scripture itself condemns unjust gain and short-sighted plunder. Think back to Deuteronomy 20.1920, limiting destruction even during warfare to preserve future resources. Healthy rivers, fertile soils, clean air. These are considered essential capital that supports durable, long-term prosperity, not hindrances to it. Therefore, prudence in environmental care is seen as anti-folly, not anti-growth. It's about discerning wise long-term investments rather than pursuing short-term exploitation that inevitably creates bigger, costlier problems down the road.
And with so many checks and balances, this integrity architecture, it's easy to imagine someone saying, look, this is just too bureaucratic, it's expensive, it slows things down too much when speed is needed.
The response to that is quite straightforward. Theft and false witness are far, far costlier in the long run, both financially and morally. Think of Exodus 20.1516, Proverbs 20.0 on dishonest scales. Open procurement, beneficial ownership registries, independent audits, these are presented not as bureaucratic hurdles for their own sake, but as institutional repentance. They are the application of honest weights and measures to the public square. These aren't bureaucratic fetishes. They're essential habits for keeping public vows, stewarding resources faithfully, and providing honest things in the sight of all, as Paul says. The upfront investment in integrity saves exponentially more down the line by preventing corruption, waste, and shoddy work.
On a similar note, in a context where corruption might be perceived as widespread or even endemic, some might dismiss these measures as simply naive, saying corruption is just how things are, dashboards and metrics won't change that.
The framework addresses this directly, describing total cynicism as a form of unbelief dressed as wisdom. It's easy to be cynical, harder to build trust. Scripture calls rulers to establish the land by justice, Proverbs 29.4. Transparent ledgers, public methods, independent checks, these are understood not as means to somehow save society in a messianic sense, but as effective restraints on sin and powerful dignifiers of honest labor. They provide practical means for accountability, they build trust incrementally, and they create an environment where honesty is more likely to be rewarded and dishonesty exposed. It's not naive. It's a practical outworking of biblical principles.
Finally, what about the objection that restitution is unworkable and will just inflame revenge? That seems like a particularly sensitive point in any post-conflict situation.
It is sensitive, and biblical restitution, as the framework points out from examples like Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 19, requires careful proof, proportionality, and due process. It's not vigilante justice. It crucially distinguishes criminal intent, requiring punishment, from civil liability, requiring repair compensation. For complex causation where pinning blame is hard, the framework suggests those pooled funds we discussed, possibly with clawback provisions if proof matures later. And critically, all of this must be pursued through the magistrate's public justice system, not through private vengeance, aligning with Romans 12 and 13 on the role of governing authorities. This ordered approach aims to quiet rancor by seeking fairness and repair, restoring neighborliness where possible, rather than inflaming revenge. The framework explicitly rejects both green idolatry and technocratic messianism, emphasizing instead diligent work through ordinary means, grounded in a hopeful realism, knowing that pursuing these proximate goods honors the coming king.
Wow, what an illuminating deep dive. We've really covered a lot of ground. We've seen how the restoration of Ukraine's environment is framed not just as a practical necessity, which it clearly is, but as a deep moral duty rooted in God's ownership of the earth and our role as stewards. We explored the devastating scale of the environmental injuries, the water, the soil, the contamination, the biodiversity loss, and then we looked at this ingenious integrity architecture designed specifically to keep the massive rebuilding process honest and accountable, plus the detailed phased plan with its built-in gate checks to ensure progress is real and responsible.
We also considered the distinct yet reinforcing roles of the different spheres, the civil magistrate, households, trades, and crucially, the church, all working ideally under Christ's lordship in their respective areas. And that creation stewardship dashboard emerged as a really central, practical tool for transparent, measurable progress, a place where truth, justice, and that necessary humility can guide action day to day. This whole approach, as the sources articulate it, really is a kind of doxological labor. It's patient, it has to be evidence-based, it demands accountability, and ultimately it's done for God's glory and the good of the neighbor.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, perhaps far from Ukraine? Maybe consider how these principles of truth, justice, and humility might apply in your own sphere, in your own work, your own community. How can we, in our own context, embrace diligent labor and ordinary means to seek the welfare, the shalom, of the places we inhabit? We are called to pursue clean water, healed soils, safer communities, truthful dealings wherever we are. Knowing that ultimately, yes, the King makes all things new, as passages like 2 Peter 3 and Revelation 21:22 point towards that final restoration. But until then, may we keep faith, keep watch, and keep clean hands in all our work.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.